Story number 1. The Whispering Room. When Mia and Jason first saw the house, they couldn't believe their luck. An old, crumbling mansion on the outskirts of town, it was way too big for just the two of them. But they saw it as a fresh start. The place had been sitting empty for years, the paint peeling off the walls, the garden overrun with weeds. But to them, it was perfect. It was the kind of house that screamed potential, the kind of house that you could make your own if you just had the courage to look past its broken windows and creaky floors. They moved in without much hesitation, excited to leave behind their cramped apartment in the city. The town was quiet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten memories. It wasn't ideal for most, but for Mia and Jason, it felt like the freedom they'd been craving. The house had something intriguing about it. Something that made you feel like it held secrets, like it was waiting for someone to uncover them. The first few days were full of unpacking, settling in, and making the place livable. The house seemed to groan and creak with every movement they made, the floorboards snapping underfoot as if protesting their presence. But that was to be expected in a house so old, wasn't it? But then the whispers started. At first, it was subtle, a soft murmur that Mia thought might have been the wind. Jason thought it was just the house settling, but soon the murmurs grew louder. They were unmistakable now, voices, faint but clear, as if someone was speaking just on the other side of the wall. Mia would be alone in the kitchen, washing dishes, and she would hear her name being whispered in a voice so low it was almost imperceptible. Mia. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, the stress of the move, the quietness of the house getting to her. But Jason heard it too. He'd be sitting in the living room, staring at the empty fireplace, and suddenly he'd freeze, his eyes scanning the walls as though expecting something to come crawling out of them. "Did you hear that?" he'd ask. "That whisper?" The whispers seemed to come from everywhere. From the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor. And sometimes they sounded almost familiar, like the voices were calling them, beckoning them deeper into the house, deeper into its secrets. One night, when the wind howled outside, rattling the windows and shaking the house to its very core, they heard something new. It wasn't just whispers now. It was a voice, a deep, guttural whisper, seeping through the cracks in the walls, dripping like thick honey into the air around them. "Mia," it said, followed by a low, menacing laugh. "Jason." Jason, looking pale and shaken, had had enough. "We need to leave. There's something wrong with this place," he said, his voice trembling. But Mia felt drawn to the house in a way she couldn't explain. It was as if it had a hold on her, the whispers now filling her mind, drowning out everything else. "I don't think we can leave," Mia whispered back, her voice distant. "I think it wants us to stay." The walls seemed to close in on them. The air felt thick with something ancient, something that had been waiting. The whispers turned into voices, clear and unmistakable now, rising like a chorus of forgotten souls. They weren't just spirits haunting the house. They were the very essence of those who had lived here before, trapped in the walls, in the floors, in the very bones of the house itself. Mia and Jason tried to escape, tried to pack their things and run, but every time they reached the door they found themselves back in the same room. The house wouldn't let them leave. It was as if the house itself was alive, twisting its halls, changing its rooms, trapping them in a never-ending maze of whispers and shadows. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. They began to hear the names of other people, people who had once lived in the mansion, people who had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the faint echoes of their existence. "Mia, Jason," the whispers said, their voices now angry and pleading. "You're one of us now. There is no escape." And they were right. There was no escape. Not from the house, not from the voices. The spirits that lingered here had claimed the souls of every living thing that dared to step inside. And Mia and Jason were no different. They stayed. And as the days bled into one another, the whispers became their only company. And with each passing day, the house took more from them, more of their memories, more of their sanity, until the only thing that remained was the house and its whispers. Now, if you pass by that old decaying mansion on the outskirts of town, you might hear it too. The soft, haunting whispers, calling your name, beckoning you inside. And once you are in, there is no way out. Story number 2. The Lake of Lost Souls. It was a place most people avoided, especially after the sun dipped below the horizon. The lake, dark and quiet, was surrounded by dense trees and long-forgotten paths. The locals in the small town of Pine Hollow would tell you stories about it, but no one would go near it. Not after what happened all those years ago. No one dared to speak of it directly, but they all knew the legend. They called it the Lake of Lost Souls. The story, as it was told, went like this. Years ago, a young girl named Emily had drowned in the lake. It was a terrible accident, or so they thought. Emily had been a good swimmer, but one afternoon, on a warm summer day, something happened. She never made it back to the shore. Her body was found days later, floating face down in the water, eyes wide open as if staring at something beneath the surface. No one ever figured out what really happened, whether it was an accident or something darker, but people whispered that the lake had claimed her, and it wouldn't stop there. It wasn't long before strange things began to happen. Fishermen would disappear, children would hear voices calling them from the water, and anyone who spent too much time near the lake would feel a cold hand gripping their heart. The lake had become a place of fear, a place where the past seemed to reach out and pull at the present, like fingers clawing at the living from beneath the surface. That's when the group of teenagers showed up. They were bored, restless, and full of that reckless energy that only youth could bring. Jason, the leader of the group, had heard the stories, of course. He'd grown up in Pine Hollow, just like the rest of them, but he didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. It was all superstition. He and his friends, Rachel, Danny, and Amy, decided they were going to uncover the truth. They were going to dive into the lake and see what was really down there. It was late afternoon when they made their way to the water's edge. The lake sat in a hollow, its surface calm and unnaturally still. The air around it felt thick, and there was an almost tangible chill in the atmosphere. Rachel, the most skeptical of the group, joked, "Come on, guys, let's just get this over with. I'm not scared of a stupid ghost." Jason smiled, but there was a hint of unease in his eyes. "We'll just dive down, see if there's anything under the water that could explain what happened to Emily." Amy was already pulling off her shoes, eager to prove she was just as brave as the others. "I'm in," she said with a grin, though there was a tremor in her voice. Danny hesitated, his eyes scanning the dark water. "I don't know about this," he muttered. "It's too quiet. It feels wrong." But Jason and Rachel pushed him forward. "You're just being a baby," Jason teased, but there was an edge to his words. Even he wasn't entirely sure about this. The stories, the warnings, the town's fear. It all seemed silly until they were standing there, staring at the lake's deep, blackened surface. They stripped down to their swimsuits and waded into the water, the chill of it sinking deep into their bones. As they swam toward the center of the lake, the quiet seemed to grow, pressing in on them from all sides. It was only then that they noticed the absence of birds, the lack of any movement on the water's surface. It was as though the world around them had stilled, holding its breath, Amy dove first, her body slicing through the cold, dark water. She was fearless, or so she thought. But when she reached the bottom, something didn't feel right. It was like the water was holding her down, pulling at her with an unnatural force. She surfaced quickly, gasping for air, but her eyes were wide with fear. "Guys, there's something down there," she said, her voice shaking. "Something. It's not normal." Jason laughed nervously. "It's just your imagination. There's nothing down there but mud and rocks." But before he could finish his sentence, Rachel screamed. The sound was high-pitched, filled with terror, and echoed across the water. Jason and Danny turned just in time to see Rachel being dragged under, her arms flailing, her face contorted in fear as something unseen, pulled her beneath the surface. "Rachel!" Jason shouted, but before he could reach her, the water calmed, and she was gone. Only the ripples remained, spreading out in all directions. Danny's face went pale, and he froze, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell just happened?" he gasped. "I don't know," Jason whispered, his voice hoarse, "but we need to get out of here now." But as they tried to swim back to shore, something grabbed Danny's leg. It wasn't the lake's cold embrace, it was something worse, something alive. He screamed, his voice swallowed by the water as the unseen force yanked him under, pulling him deeper into the depths. Jason and Amy were the only ones left. They made it to shore, both of them shaking, gasping for air. But something was different. The water, which had once been still, now churned and boiled with unseen movement. It was as if the lake was alive, and it was angry. Jason turned to Amy, his face pale and his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to go. We need to—" But before he could finish, the water reached out again. It wasn't just water anymore. It was something darker, something that had waited all these years to be released. The lake had taken its payment, and now it wanted more. Amy's scream echoed in the air as the water surged, dragging her back into its depths. Jason tried to pull her back, but it was too late. The lake had claimed her, just as it had claimed the others before her. Jason was alone, standing at the edge of the water, his mind racing. He had come here for answers, but now he understood the truth. The lake wasn't just cursed, it was a living thing, a thing that fed on the souls of the lost. And now, Jason was one of them. The town of Pine Hollow would never be the same. The lake would always be there, waiting, its surface calm and deceptive. And those who ventured too close, who sought the truth, would find themselves pulled beneath, their souls claimed by the water, lost forever in the lake of lost souls. Story number 3. The Dollmaker's Curse. When the fire started, no one knew what had really caused it. It was late one winter night, the kind where the wind howls through the trees and the snow falls in thick, choking flurries. The flames licked at the edges of the dollmaker's shop for hours, until the building collapsed in on itself, a towering inferno lighting up the entire street. By the time the fire trucks arrived, there was nothing left but ashes and charred wood. No body was ever found, and the dollmaker, known only as Mr. Parson, was presumed dead. But that was the thing about Mr. Parson. He had always been strange. He was a recluse, never seen in town except for the occasional trip to the market to buy supplies. He had a way of staring at you, like he was looking through you, into something far darker than anyone ever dared to ask about. And no one knew how he made the dolls, or why they looked so lifelike. They weren't like any dolls you'd see in a toy store. No, these dolls had eyes that followed you, and skin that seemed too real, too soft. The worst part? The way they smiled. It was never quite right. They were always too perfect, too knowing. People whispered about the dolls, about the children he'd taken in over the years. They said he had made a deal with something that required a sacrifice. But no one could prove anything, and no one dared get too close. Not after all the disappearances, the children who had vanished over the years, always from the families who had come into contact with Mr. Parson. Each time, a doll would show up at the door, a new one, just like the others. Too lifelike, too real. Then the fire happened. The town tried to move on, but some things linger, even after the flames have died. That's how it was when the Walker family moved into the old dollmaker's house. The Walkers weren't the sort of family to believe in ghosts or curses. They were a typical suburban family. Michael and Rachel, with their 2 kids, Charlie and Emma, ages 10 and 7. They were looking for a fresh start, and the house, though a little run down, was perfect for their needs. It was spacious, tucked away at the end of a quiet street, away from the hustle and bustle of the town. They had no idea about the history of the house. They had no idea what had happened to the doll maker, or what was left behind. It didn't take long for them to notice the dolls. At first, they were scattered around the house, sitting on mantels, perched on shelves, and tucked into corners like forgotten relics. The Walkers thought they were just left behind from the previous owner, but there was something unsettling about them. Charlie was the first to find one in the attic. It was a doll unlike any he'd seen before. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with eyes so vivid that they seemed to follow him as he moved. It had an odd, crooked smile, and when Charlie held it, he felt a strange chill creep up his spine. He didn't want to be scared, so he shoved the doll in the back of a closet and didn't think about it again. But soon, more of the dolls began to appear in odd places. In the kitchen cupboard, in the bathroom, at the foot of the bed. Michael and Rachel laughed it off, thinking it was just a prank, maybe left by the previous owners. They even joked about it, wondering if the doll maker had a penchant for hiding his creations in random places. But it wasn't a joke anymore when Emma began to talk to the dolls. At first, Rachel thought it was cute. Her little girl playing pretend, speaking to the dolls like they were real people. Emma would sit for hours in front of the fireplace, talking softly to the dolls she'd placed around her, telling them stories. But then Rachel started to hear things in the middle of the night. Soft murmurs, like whispers, coming from Emma's room. One night, unable to sleep, Rachel crept down the hallway to check on her daughter. As she peeked inside, her heart nearly stopped. Emma was sitting on the floor, surrounded by a circle of dolls. Their eyes weren't just watching her. They seemed to be moving, shifting. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she watched Emma smile and whisper, "They like me, Mommy. They say I'm their favorite." It was then that Rachel realized something was very wrong. The dolls weren't just toys, they weren't just lifelike. They were alive in some twisted way. Rachel tried to tell Michael, but he didn't believe her at first. He thought she was just stressed, overreacting. But when he went into the attic to check for himself, he found the dolls, hundreds of them, lined up, staring at him. Each one seemed to have its own expression, its own personality. Some smiled, others frowned, but they all looked too real, too human. And then Michael saw it. One of the dolls was different. It was a little girl, with blonde curls and a dress that seemed too old-fashioned. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly at him. And it wasn't just the look of the doll that sent a cold shiver down his spine. It was the fact that it seemed to be alive. He could feel it. A presence. An energy. The next morning, Charlie was gone. Just vanished. No sign of a struggle, no evidence of anything. He was simply gone, like he'd never existed. Emma was the next to go. Rachel found her sitting on the stairs talking to the dolls in a strange, sing-song voice. "They want us to join them, Mommy," she said, her eyes glazed over. "They say we can't leave." That's when Rachel knew. The dolls weren't just toys. They were the spirits of the children Mr. Parson had taken, trapped in these lifeless bodies, hungry for new souls to take. The walkers tried to escape, but it was too late. The dolls had already claimed Emma, and now they wanted Michael and Rachel. That night, as Michael and Rachel lay in bed, the whispers started. Soft at first, then louder, until the walls seemed to pulse with the sound. The dolls were everywhere, filling the room, standing at the foot of the bed, watching with their cold, glassy eyes. Michael reached for Rachel's hand, but she was already gone. She had vanished, pulled beneath the dolls, swallowed by the curse that had been waiting for so many years. And now, the house stood empty once again. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers, soft, haunting voices calling out from the dolls, searching for new souls to claim. The doll-maker's curse still lingers, and it always will, waiting for the next family to come along, just as it always has. Story number 4. The Blood-Red Mirror. It was the kind of thing you didn't question, not at first. A piece of furniture, an heirloom, passed down from generation to generation. The blood-red mirror, they called it, though no one quite remembered where the name came from. It was just a part of the family's history. Like the old house, the creaking floors, the faded pictures on the walls. When Sarah's grandmother died, it was expected that the mirror would find a new place in her life. It had always been there, and now it was hers. At first, it seemed like just another beautiful, old object. A heavy, gilded frame, dark wood with intricate carvings of twisted vines and roses. The glass itself was tinted a deep, dark red. Not bright like fresh blood, but more like a rich, dark wine that caught the light just wrong, making it appear alive. Sarah thought it looked like a relic from another time. Something ancient and forgotten, but beautiful in its own way. She had no idea what she was about to inherit. It started small, just a flicker of movement in the mirror's reflection. Sarah would pass by it in the hallway of her grandmother's house, and for a split second, she'd think she saw something move in the glass. Her own face maybe, but distorted, like someone was standing just behind her. She'd shake it off, blaming it on her tired eyes, or the way the light shifted in the house. But then the figures started to form. It was subtle at first. One day, while getting ready for school, Sarah glanced into the mirror and noticed that the reflection wasn't quite right. She saw herself, of course, but there was someone else standing behind her. A woman, tall, thin, with long black hair. Sarah spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. The house was empty, quiet, as it always was when Sarah was alone. The reflection, though, it didn't lie. The woman was still there, standing just behind Sarah, as if watching her. She stared into the mirror for what felt like an eternity, and the woman didn't move. She just watched. Sarah thought she was losing her mind. The strange occurrences became more frequent. Each day, the mirror seemed to pull her in more. The woman behind her wasn't the only one now. Other figures appeared, some blurry, others more defined. A child with hollow eyes. An old man with a twisted, grimace-like smile. Faces that seemed to grow out of the mirror, stretching and shifting like shadows that were trying to claw their way out. She stopped talking about it to anyone. She didn't want them to think she was crazy. Her parents would chalk it up to stress, to her being a teenager, to any number of things that had nothing to do with the mirror. But Sarah knew what she was seeing wasn't a trick of the light, and it wasn't her imagination. Every time she looked into the mirror, the figures grew closer. They seemed to know her, to be aware of her presence. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night to find herself staring into it, her eyes wide open, drawn to the red-tinted glass as if something was calling to her. One night, when she couldn't sleep, Sarah sat in front of the mirror, staring into the blood-red depths, willing the figures to show themselves. They did. At first, she saw only faint shapes, like smoke swirling in the glass. But then, she saw the woman again, standing right in front of her, her face pressed against the mirror, her eyes wide with desperation. The woman's mouth moved. Sarah could hear her, though the words were soft, like whispers beneath the surface of water. "Help me, let me out," the woman said, her voice a low, mournful sound. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. The woman's face twisted in agony. "Please, I'm trapped. You have to let me out. We all are." The next few days were a blur of panic and confusion. Sarah tried to avoid the mirror, but it was impossible. Everywhere she went in the house, she could feel its pull. It was like the mirror was calling to her, drawing her in, a silent scream that echoed in her mind. The figures inside were more desperate now, more violent. Hands pressed against the glass, fingers clawing and scratching, as if they were trying to break through. The reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something more, a prison, a trap, a cage that held them all in. The spirits were desperate to break free, and every time Sarah looked into it, they got closer. One night, as the wind howled outside, Sarah stood in front of the mirror again, but this time she didn't look away. She couldn't. The figures inside were reaching for her, their faces twisted in anger, in fear, in sorrow. They were so close now, their fingers touching the glass, their eyes locked onto hers. The woman, who had been the first, was there again, her face pressed against the glass, her lips parted in a silent scream. "Let me out," she cried, her voice now louder, more urgent. "Help us, before it's too late." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the mirror. It was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt. The air around her seemed to grow thick, heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The glass, it was alive. She could feel it, pulsing with a force she couldn't understand. The last thing Sarah saw before she was swallowed up by the mirror was the faces of the trapped spirits, their eyes filled with endless hunger. The next morning, the mirror stood still, as it always had. But now, if you look closely, you'll see her. Sarah, her face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with terror. And the spirits, they're still there too, trapped, waiting, hungry. And the blood-red mirror? It's waiting for its next victim. Story number 5. The Haunted Forest. The town of Alder's Hollow had always been a quiet place, nestled between hills and forgotten roads. It wasn't much, just a handful of houses, a small school, and a corner store that sold more coffee than anything else. But there was one thing about Alder's Hollow that made it different from any other small town in the country. It was surrounded by the forest. No one really knew how long the forest had been there. Some said it had been standing for centuries, its trees old as time, their roots sunk deep into the earth. The townspeople avoided it, except for a few who had to cross through it on their way to nearby towns. There were stories, of course. Stories passed down like old secrets whispered on the wind. The forest was cursed, they said. Anyone who entered never came back. The spirits of those who had gotten lost were trapped within the trees, their souls bound to the forest for eternity, feeding off the fear of the living. It wasn't until a group of hikers arrived one bright spring morning that anyone in Alder's Hollow thought the curse might be more than just a story. 4 friends, Mark, Emily, Sean, and Rachel, had come to Alder's Hollow for a weekend getaway. They were all experienced hikers, the kind of people who loved to explore places others would shy away from. They'd heard the rumors about the forest, but they shrugged it off. A forest was a forest, right? What could possibly go wrong? They parked at the edge of the woods, where the trees stood tall and dark, the shadows stretching long into the morning light. The air was thick, a strange kind of stillness hanging in the air, as though the world was holding its breath. Emily, the most cautious of the group, had a strange feeling when she looked at the forest, like something was watching her from the shadows. But she told herself it was nothing. "This is going to be awesome," Sean said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "We'll be back in no time." The forest was quiet as they entered, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves and underbrush. For the first hour they marveled at the trees. Tall, ancient, their bark twisted and gnarled like the fingers of old men. The sunlight barely pierced through the canopy, casting a dim, golden glow over the path ahead. But then, things began to feel wrong. It started with the silence. The deeper they walked, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling animals. The only sound was the crunch of their feet against the forest floor. And then the air changed, growing colder, heavier. Every step they took seemed to bring them further into the shadows, into something alive. Mark, who had been leading the group, stopped suddenly, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Everyone paused, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the eerie silence. But then, faint whispers. It was hard to make out the words, but there was no mistaking the sound. It was a low murmur, like the forest itself was breathing. "What the hell is that?" Rachel whispered, her heart pounding. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. "Probably just the wind," Sean said, but his voice trembled slightly. He wasn't so sure now. They kept walking, but it was getting harder to ignore the feeling of being watched. The trees were too close now, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The path had disappeared, leaving only a labyrinth of trunks and tangled roots. And when they tried to retrace their steps, the way back was gone. The trees had closed in, trapping them. "We're lost," Emily said, her voice shaking. "This isn't right. We've been walking in circles." Mark looked around, trying to keep his panic in check. "It's just the forest. We'll find a way out." But it wasn't just the forest. Something was wrong. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides, and the whispers, they were growing louder, clearer. Now they sounded like voices, not the wind. Soft, pleading voices, murmuring just out of reach. They didn't sound human. "Get out, leave us, leave now." The words were clear, and they sent a chill down Sean's spine. "What the hell was that?" he asked, looking at his friends, his eyes wide with fear. "It's the spirits," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "The ones trapped here, the ones the town warns you about. They're not just stories, they're real." Before anyone could respond, the trees shifted. It was subtle, but it was enough to make them stop in their tracks. The forest had moved. The trees had closed in further, their branches twisting together like fingers locking around them, making it impossible to turn back. Mark turned in every direction, trying to find any trace of the path they'd walked, but the forest was vast and unchanging. The whispering voices grew louder, growing frantic. "Help us! Help us! Please!" Something shifted beneath the leaves. Mark froze, his blood running cold. The ground trembled, as if something was moving beneath the earth itself. And then they saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed. It was a man, but not quite. His body was twisted, his limbs too long, his mouth wide in a grin that was more like a snarl. His eyes were hollow, like the eyes of someone who had been lost for far too long. "Run!" Emily gasped, but it was too late. The figure stepped forward, and the ground seemed to swallow him up. More figures emerged from the shadows, their faces distorted with fear and rage, their mouths open in silent screams. And then the trees closed in, wrapping around them, their branches like chains, pulling them deeper into the forest. The whispers surrounded them, drowning out everything else. The spirits were hungry. They were always hungry. The hikers never made it out. In Alder's Hollow, life went on as usual. The townspeople still avoided the forest, still whispered about the curse, and every now and then a new hiker would come through, oblivious to the stories, drawn by the promise of adventure. They would step into the forest, and the forest would take them, just like it always had. Because the forest wasn't just a place, it was a thing, alive and waiting, and it would never let you go. Story number 6, The Old Theater. The old Sinclair Theater had stood on the corner of Pine and 5th Street for over 100 years. Back in its prime, it had been the heart of the town, a place of laughter, tears, and the kind of magic only theater could offer. But that was before the fire that took part of the building, turning it into a hollow shell of its former self. The walls were charred, the seats were covered in dust, and the stage, once vibrant and full of life, was now nothing more than a blackened ruin. Years passed, and the town moved on. People forgot about the Sinclair, or at least they tried to. But the building never really left. It sat there, decaying, waiting for someone to return, as all old things do. Then came the filmmakers, a group of aspiring directors and actors, young, eager, and desperate to make a name for themselves, decided to use the old Sinclair as the set for their latest low-budget horror film. They had no idea what they were getting into. They'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town had. The fire that killed the actors, the strange disappearances, the rumors about the theater being haunted. But that was all it was. Stories. Just another piece of the town's past that everyone liked to gossip about. They didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. At first, everything seemed perfect. The building had a kind of eerie charm that made it ideal for their movie. The old velvet curtains, the cracked marble floors, the dimly lit chandelier that hung above the stage. It all looked like something out of a dream or a nightmare, depending on how you looked at it. The filmmakers set up their cameras, brought in the props, and started rehearsing their scenes. But as the sun set and the shadows crept through the theater, something started to feel off. It started with the sound. A low, groaning creak from somewhere in the back of the theater. Then came the whispers. Quiet at first, like the wind rustling through old pages, but soon louder, more distinct. The filmmakers brushed it off as nothing. The building was old, after all. It was just the wood settling, the pipes groaning, the usual things old buildings do. But then the actors began to feel it. The first one to notice was Claire, the lead actress. She was standing on stage, rehearsing a scene where she was supposed to be frightened, screaming at an invisible figure in the dark. She did it once, twice, until she froze. Her eyes darted nervously toward the wings of the stage. "You feel that?" she asked. The other actors looked at her, confused. "The air," Claire said, her voice shaking slightly. "It's thick, like something's here." But the others didn't feel it. They were too focused on their lines, their positions. They had a job to do, and they were going to do it. That's when the lights flickered. Then they went out completely. "Great," said Tom, the director. "Just what we need, a power outage." They all assumed it was a simple electrical problem. But when the lights came back on, something had changed. The set was the same, but the air was different. It was colder, heavier. The walls felt closer, the darkness deeper. The filmmakers brushed it off again, laughing nervously as they continued to rehearse. But every time they tried to practice a scene, something went wrong. The props would shift when no one was touching them. The costumes would be in different places. And sometimes, when they turned away from the stage, they'd catch glimpses of figures in the shadows. Figures that weren't part of the film. At first, they thought it was their imaginations playing tricks on them. After all, they were filming a horror movie. It was easy to get spooked. But then things started to escalate. During one rehearsal, Claire screamed, her usual frightened, dramatic scream. But this time, it wasn't fake. It was real. She turned, eyes wide, and pointed at the stage. "There's someone there," she said, her voice trembling. Everyone turned. No one was there. But the air grew thicker, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the stage. The actors began to panic, their breathing quickening. They tried to leave, but the doors wouldn't open. They were locked, the handles cold and unyielding. Then the spirits started to speak. The whispers, which had once been soft and distant, now filled the entire theater. They weren't just murmurs anymore. They were voices. Angry, desperate voices calling out from the darkness. The filmmakers could hear them clearly now, but the words didn't make sense. They were jumbled, overlapping, like people shouting over each other. And all the while, the figures from the shadows began to move, walking across the stage in slow, deliberate steps, each of them in a costume that seemed impossibly real. "They're reenacting their final scenes," Claire whispered, her face pale as she backed away from the stage. "The ones from the fire." Tom tried to shake it off to keep everyone focused. "This is just part of the movie, okay? This is what we signed up for." But it wasn't part of the movie. They could feel it now. The line between what was real and what was fake was starting to blur. The actors had begun to take on the roles of the spirits that had died in the fire. Their performances weren't just lines and movements anymore. They were living the terror those spirits had felt, the pain of their final moments. As the night dragged on, the filmmakers became more and more trapped. The spirits didn't just haunt the stage, they haunted the entire theater. The walls seemed to close in on them, the very air growing dense with fear. The whispers became screams, and the actors, now fully possessed by the spirits, began to act out their final moments with terrifying intensity. Claire, once the lead actress, found herself standing at the front of the stage, her body rigid with fear as she reenacted the moment of the fire. The heat, the smoke, the unbearable panic. Tom tried to call her name, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the flames, which seemed to fill the room. The theater itself was burning, just like it had so many years ago. And then, as the smoke thickened and the heat intensified, the filmmakers realized the truth. They weren't making a movie anymore. They were living in it. The spirits had dragged them into their nightmare, and they would never escape. When the fire that had destroyed the theater had finally faded, when the smoke had cleared, the only thing left standing was the Sinclair Theater. Its doors opened wide, ready for the next group of filmmakers who dared to disturb the spirits within. And the cycle would begin again. Story number 7. The Spirit of the Asylum. The old asylum sat on the outskirts of a town, forgotten by most, except for the few old-timers who still whispered about it, their voices shaking with a mix of fear and regret. The building was a hulking thing, its stone walls gray and cracked, its windows dark and empty, like eyes that had long ago turned blind. It had been abandoned for years, ever since the last of the patients were moved out and the place was shut down. Some said it was because of a fire, others because of an outbreak. But the real reason was something darker, something no one dared to speak aloud. The asylum's reputation was infamous, known for its brutal treatments and the twisted minds of the doctors who ran it. They'd do things to the patients, horrible things, treatments that were more like torture than therapy. And when the doctors were gone, so too were the patients. But not the spirits. The spirits remained, trapped inside the walls, twisted by pain and fear, unable to escape. It wasn't until a group of paranormal investigators decided to visit the old building that anyone dared to enter again. They were a confident bunch, young and full of fire, believing they could handle whatever the asylum could throw at them. They had cameras, equipment, and bravado. They'd been in worse places, but none of them knew what they were walking into. The team consisted of 4 people. Derek, the leader, who had a camera in his hand and a bold smile on his face. Sarah, the skeptic, always ready with a sarcastic remark and an eye roll. Michael, the sensitive one, who felt things others couldn't. And Rachel, the tech genius, whose knowledge of equipment was unmatched. They arrived at the asylum just as the sun was setting, the light fading from the sky as the wind picked up, sending leaves skittering across the broken pavement. The building loomed ahead, its broken windows like dark mouths waiting to swallow them whole. The door creaked open with a push, and the group stepped inside, the stale air heavy with dust and decay. "Welcome to hell," Derek muttered, setting up the first camera at the entrance. His voice echoed in the hollow space. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they moved deeper into the asylum. The walls seemed to close in on them, their faded paint peeling away like dead skin, revealing the old, rotting wood beneath. Sarah snorted, half amused, half nervous. "It's just an old building, no ghosts here, guys." But as they moved further inside, something changed. The temperature dropped, and Michael shivered, his breath coming out in small puffs. "I don't like this," he said quietly. "It feels wrong." Rachel glanced around, frowning. "It's just an old building. You guys are freaking yourselves out." But Derek, ever the optimist, wasn't listening. He was busy setting up more equipment, adjusting the cameras and placing EMF detectors in the corners of each room. "If anything happens, we'll catch it on film. This is going to be great." They continued deeper into the asylum, past empty rooms that had once been filled with the cries of patients, past hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. It wasn't long before they reached the old treatment rooms, rooms with rusted medical equipment, faded leather chairs, and old metal beds bolted to the floors. The air here felt thick, heavy with memories. And then they heard it. A low moan. Not from any human throat, but from the building itself. Derek paused, his camera in hand. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked. "I didn't hear anything," Sarah replied, though she was looking around nervously. "Someone's here," Michael whispered, his eyes darting around the room. "It's not just the wind. There's something alive." The temperature dropped even more, and Rachel's fingers froze on the equipment she was adjusting. The lights flickered, and then the air seemed to hum, like 1,000 whispers rose from the walls at once. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was alive, the feeling of something ancient and hungry, crawling into their skin. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash. Rachel screamed, stumbling back into the corner, her eyes wide with fear. The cameras began to glitch, static filling the screens as the air grew thicker, almost unbearable. "Let us out," Sarah shouted, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the building itself had sealed them in. And then the whispers started. They were faint at first, just barely audible, like the scratching of nails on stone. But then they grew louder. Voices, pleading, screaming, chanting. It was coming from everywhere. inside the walls, under the floor, above their heads. The sound was deafening. They couldn't make out the words, but they didn't need to. The terror in the voices said it all. "Get out!" Michael gasped, his face pale. They want us to leave. They want us to leave now." But it was too late. The building seemed to breathe around them. The walls pulsed, as if alive, as though the asylum itself was feeding off their fear. And that's when they saw them. Figures, blurry and indistinct at first, but then becoming clearer. Faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and dark, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. The spirits of the patients, trapped for so long, had merged with the asylum itself. They were the asylum now. The asylum was them. One by one, the investigators started to panic. Derek's camera fell to the floor with a crash as he backed away, his face twisted with terror. Sarah screamed and tried to run, but the hall stretched endlessly before her, pulling her deeper into the maze. Michael, shaking uncontrollably, clutched his head, whispering to himself that they couldn't escape, that they weren't meant to. Rachel was the last to break. She turned to the others, but they were already gone, swallowed up by the building. The walls were closing in on her, and she realized in that moment the truth. The asylum didn't just trap bodies, it trapped souls. And as the last breath left her body, she was swallowed by the darkness, her mind shattered by the horrors she had witnessed. The building was silent again, the whispers fading. The asylum had claimed its latest victims. Years later, another group would come. Another group of eager investigators, excited for the thrill of the unknown. And the asylum would be waiting, because it never forgets. It never lets go. The spirit of the asylum is always hungry, always waiting. Story number 8. The Possession of Lillian Moore. Lillian Moore was never the type to believe in ghosts, demons, or anything supernatural. She grew up in a small town in Maine, surrounded by fields and forests, and the only things that ever haunted her were the memories of her childhood. Memories of a home filled with love, laughter, and the occasional family argument. Her mother, Annabelle, was kind, strong, and always made sure Lillian had everything she needed. Her father, Thomas, worked hard as a carpenter, and while he wasn't always the most expressive, Lillian never doubted his love for her. But it all changed the day Lillian turned 23. At first, it was just small things. Shadows in the corner of her eyes. A strange sense of déjà vu, like something was just about to happen. She would walk into a room, and for a moment, the air would feel thicker, heavier, as if someone were standing just behind her. The first time it happened, she shrugged it off. Maybe it was the stress of finishing her degree. She'd been working long hours, balancing studying and a part-time job. Everyone gets tired, everyone gets stressed. Then came the dreams. At first, they were simple. Nightmares about being lost in the woods, running from something just out of sight. But they grew darker with every passing night. She'd wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, her breath shallow. And with each dream, she started to feel like something was calling to her. An ancient guttural voice whispering her name from the deep, dark corners of her mind. The dreams felt real, too real, and they left a coldness in her chest that wouldn't go away. She told herself it was just stress. It had to be, nothing more. But the visions came during the day too. She'd be sitting at her desk, typing an email, and suddenly she'd feel a sharp, almost unbearable pain in the back of her head, like a weight pressing down on her skull. The room would warp around her, the edges growing darker, as though the walls were breathing. And then she'd see it. Glimpses of something, or someone, staring at her from the corners of her vision. The shadows would stretch, twist, and contort into shapes that seemed far too real. One evening, As Lillian sat on the couch, her mother sitting beside her, a sudden thought crossed her mind. A thought so cold, so strange, that it made her stomach churn. What if something is inside me? It was ridiculous, but the thought lingered, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. The first time she noticed the change was when she got angry. Lillian was a calm person. She didn't lose her temper easily, especially not over something small. But that night, her mother made a simple comment about the house, about the creaking floorboards, and for some reason, it hit Lillian in a way it never had before. "I can't believe you're still making excuses for this old house," Lillian snapped, her voice sharp and harsh, unlike anything she'd heard come out of her own mouth. Her mother looked at her, startled. Lillian's pulse quickened, her hands shaking, but she couldn't stop. "You should have left this place years ago, but no. You insisted on staying here, didn't you? Just like you always do." Her mother's face softened, a hint of concern crossing her features. "Lily, honey, what's wrong? You're acting like someone I don't know." That hit Lillian like a slap to the face. She didn't recognize herself anymore either. What had happened to her? Why did she feel like there was someone else? Someone dark and angry taking control of her mind. Days passed, and Lillian became more isolated. She stopped seeing her friends, stopped going out. The voices in her head grew louder, their whispers more insistent. They told her things. Things about her family, about her bloodline. She tried to shut them out, but the whispers didn't stop. They told her about the pact, about the ancient evil that had been passed down through her family for generations. It was a spirit, they said. A spirit that had promised immortality to her ancestor. A powerful witch who had bargained her soul for eternal life. But the spirit had never left. It was inside her, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to take control. And now, that moment had come. One night, Lillian sat in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her wasn't her. Not really. Her eyes were too dark, her face too pale, her smile too wide, as if it wasn't hers at all. It was the spirit. It was the spirit trying to take over. It was trying to become her. She screamed, stumbling back, but the reflection stayed. The woman, no, the thing, in the mirror smiled back, its lips curling upward in a twisted mockery of her own expression. Lillian backed away, but it was no use. The spirit was already inside her. The days that followed were a blur. Lillian could feel the spirit growing stronger within her, its voice pushing against her mind, taking over her thoughts. She couldn't control it anymore. It was her body, but not her mind. She would look at her mother and feel nothing, only the urge to hurt her, to push her away. The spirit whispered that her mother was weak, that she didn't deserve to live. And in moments of weakness, Lillian almost gave in. But there was a part of her, a small part deep inside, still fighting. She couldn't do it. She couldn't let the spirit take her entirely. But with every passing day, the struggle grew harder. The spirit was more powerful, and it was gaining ground. It fed off her anger, her fear, her confusion, and soon it would control her completely. Lillian didn't know how much longer she could hold on. The spirit was so close now. She could feel it, deep in her bones. The battle was almost over, and soon she would be nothing more than a shell, a vessel for something far older, far darker than she could have ever imagined. In the end, Lillian Moore was never truly free. The spirit of her ancestor, her great-great-grandmother the witch, had claimed her, and it would live on inside her for eternity. And though the world would never know her name, her story would continue, whispered in the dark, just like the voices inside her mind. Because some pacts can never be broken. Story number 9. the house on Gravesend Hill. When Emily and Tom first saw the house on Gravesend Hill, it was everything they had ever dreamed of. The charming Victorian house sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick trees and a large, overgrown yard. It was everything they wanted. Spacious, full of character, and most importantly, affordable. They had been searching for a home for months, and when this one appeared on the market, it seemed too perfect to pass up. The house had its flaws, of course. The windows were a bit drafty, and the paint on the exterior was starting to peel in places. The front porch creaked like an old man's bones, and the garden was wild and unkempt. But to Emily and Tom, these imperfections only added to its charm. They saw it as a fixer-upper, a place they could make their own. It wasn't until they started moving in that they realized something was wrong. At first, it was subtle. Just little things that didn't quite make sense. A picture frame that would be crooked when they returned to a room, the occasional draft in the hallway, and the soft sound of footsteps when no one was around. Emily, ever the skeptic, brushed it off. "Old houses make noises. It's nothing," she said with a smile, trying to reassure Tom. But Tom wasn't so sure. He had always been sensitive to things like that, and the feeling in the house seemed off. It wasn't just the creaky floorboards or the gusts of wind that would blow through the house even when the windows were closed. It was something deeper, something he couldn't put his finger on. Things started to escalate. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, Emily and Tom were sitting on the couch in the living room, enjoying a quiet moment. Suddenly, a loud thud came from upstairs. Both of them jumped up at the same time, exchanging startled glances. "What was that?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," Tom said, his stomach tightening. "But I don't like it." They both hesitated before climbing the stairs to investigate. As they walked down the hallway, they noticed something even stranger. The air felt heavy, like it was thick with something unseen. The hallway, which should have been filled with the normal, familiar shadows of night, felt wrong. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed deeper, as though something was hiding there, watching them. When they reached the bedroom, the thud had stopped. The room was empty, save for their unpacked boxes and the old, creaky furniture. But the feeling remained. Something was wrong. The next few days brought more unsettling experiences. The lights flickered, strange noises came from the attic, and objects started moving on their own. Tom found the old rocking chair in the living room swaying back and forth, even though no one was sitting in it. At first, he tried to convince himself it was just the wind, but the motion felt unnatural, as though it had a life of its own. Emily's nerves started to wear thin. The sense of dread in the house was growing, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, as she was standing in the kitchen preparing dinner, she caught a glimpse of a figure in the reflection of the window. She whipped around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, but her heart was pounding in her chest. That night, Tom woke up to find Emily sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty doorway with wide, terrified eyes. "Emily?" he asked softly, but she didn't respond. Her body was stiff, her eyes unblinking. "Emily, talk to me," he urged. Finally, she turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's someone here," she said. "In the house. I've seen them." Tom didn't know what to say. He tried to comfort her, but his own fear was starting to creep in. He had seen things too, figures in the corners of his vision, shadowy shapes that moved when he wasn't looking. It wasn't just the house being old, it was something else. The worst came one night when they were both lying awake in bed. A cold breeze swept through the room, even though the windows were shut tight. Emily shivered and pulled the covers up around her neck, but Tom felt a coldness settle deep in his bones. It wasn't just the temperature. It was something inside the room, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Then a voice. Soft at first, then growing louder. "Get out." It was a whisper, but it sounded as though it was right next to them. Tom's heart raced as he turned toward Emily. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. She nodded slowly. "It's them, the ones who were here before us." That's when they realized the truth. The house wasn't just old, it was built on something far darker. The land beneath it had once been a burial ground, an ancient cemetery where people were buried in unmarked graves. The spirits of the dead, disturbed by the construction of the house, were still here, restless and angry, seeking revenge for their forgotten graves. As the days passed, the spirits grew more aggressive. The whispers turned into cries, then into screams. The house felt alive with anger, as if the very walls were closing in on them. Doors slammed shut, windows shattered without cause, and they began to see more than just shadows. The figures, pale, translucent forms, started appearing in the corners of their vision, reaching out, their eyes hollow with rage. Emily and Tom knew they had to leave, but the house wouldn't let them. Every time they tried to pack, they found the boxes emptied, the doors locked, and the windows bolted shut. The spirits were trapping them, keeping them there as a part of their collection, just like the others who had lived and died in the house before them. Desperate, Emily began to research the history of the land, hoping to find a way to appease the spirits. It was then that she learned the horrifying truth. The spirits didn't just want to be acknowledged. They wanted to be released. They wanted their graves to be respected, their memories honored. But the rituals required were not simple, and even if they performed them, there was no guarantee the spirits would let them go. They had become too powerful, too desperate. One final night, the couple stood together in the living room, the air thick with fear. The spirits were surrounding them, pressing in from all sides. The house was shaking, groaning under the weight of the angry dead. Tom turned to Emily, his face pale, his eyes filled with defeat. "We're not getting out, are we?" he whispered. Emily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't think so." The spirits had claimed their home. The house on Gravesend Hill would never let them leave. And as the darkness closed in, the couple became part of its collection. Another pair of lost souls, trapped forever in the house where the dead still lingered. Story number 10. The Cursed Piano. Liam Ashford had never been one to believe in the supernatural. A struggling musician with nothing but a few broken instruments and an old guitar, he was used to disappointment. His dreams of stardom felt like they were slipping away with every passing year. He'd spent countless hours composing music, playing at dive bars and small clubs, but nothing ever clicked. The world seemed indifferent, and he was on the edge of giving up. Then came the letter. It was a strange, thick envelope, postmarked from a town he had never heard of. Inside, a single sheet of paper, yellowed, fragile, and written in elegant cursive, invited him to claim an inheritance from a distant relative he never knew existed. The letter spoke of an old piano, one that had once belonged to a famous composer. It was now his, free to take, as long as he came to the small town of Harrow's Reach to pick it up. Liam had never been one to turn down an opportunity. Perhaps this piano, whatever it was, could help him in ways he didn't fully understand. Maybe it could be the key to turning his music into something that mattered. He arrived in Harrow's Reach 2 weeks later, a sleepy little town tucked away in the woods, its cobblestone streets lined with dark, oppressive buildings. The house he was directed to was just as old and foreboding, an ancient Victorian home with ivy creeping up its sides and a door that creaked when he knocked. The man who answered was elderly, with deep wrinkles and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. His name was Gregory, and he greeted Liam with a weary smile. "The piano's waiting for you," Gregory said, his voice low and raspy. "It's in the parlor, but lad, I'll warn you, the music it plays isn't the kind you're used to." Liam brushed off the warning, eager to see the piano. He had heard rumors of the composer's name, Edgar Forsyth. A brilliant, once celebrated artist, Forsyth's name had faded into obscurity after a scandal that ruined his career. No one had ever spoken much about him after that. He died young, tragically, under mysterious circumstances. But the piano was still here, waiting for someone to unlock its secrets. The piano was magnificent, black and polished to a mirror-like sheen. Its keys gleamed, and as Liam sat down, he felt an overwhelming pull. It was as though the piano was calling to him, beckoning him to play. He ran his fingers across the keys, unsure of what to expect, and a single note echoed through the room, as pure and haunting as any sound he'd ever heard. It sent a shiver down his spine. He began to play. At first, it was just simple melodies, slow, mournful pieces that sounded familiar, like something he had heard before. But as he continued, the music began to change. The notes grew darker, more intricate, as if they were writing themselves in his mind. It was unlike anything Liam had ever composed. He had no idea where it was coming from, but it felt right, beautiful even. The sound filled the room, and for the first time in years he felt alive. He had found his voice. As days turned into weeks, the music became more powerful. Liam's playing began to improve at an astonishing rate. The melodies were haunting, complex, filled with emotion, something that could capture the world's attention. And it did. He began to play at larger venues, the music that flowed from him sweeping audiences off their feet. His career skyrocketed, and Liam felt a sense of invincibility. The world was finally taking notice. But with success came something darker. Liam began to lose control. The music wasn't just coming from him anymore. It was as though something else was writing it, guiding his hands across the keys, shaping his every note. The melodies grew darker, twisted, filled with longing and rage. He found himself composing songs he didn't remember writing, melodies that haunted him long after he stopped playing. He would wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the piano calling to him from the other room, its keys echoing in the silence. And then, the nightmares started. Every night he dreamed of Edgar Forsyth. The composer's face was gaunt and twisted, his eyes empty, as though his soul had been drained away. In these dreams, Forsyth would whisper to him, urging him to play harder, to reach for more. "The world owes you this," the composer's voice would rasp. "Take what is yours." Liam tried to fight it, but the pull of the piano was too strong. He needed it. He craved it. The music became his obsession, and every day the spirit of Forsyth seemed to grow stronger, his influence seeping deeper into Liam's mind. Forsyth's voice grew louder, more insistent. "More! You must have more. Fame, fortune, power. You can have it all. All you need is me." Liam's life began to unravel. He alienated friends and family, those few who had been there for him before the fame. He could no longer differentiate between the music he was writing and the commands of Forsyth's voice in his head. The lines between his own thoughts and the composer's desires blurred. The music was consuming him, and with every passing day, Forsyth's spirit took a little more of his soul. One night, after a sold-out performance, Liam found himself alone in the concert hall. The piano sat in front of him, waiting, as if it knew he was coming. He approached it, his fingers trembling. When he touched the keys, the music began to play itself. It wasn't his hands on the keys anymore. The piano moved on its own, the music taking shape in dark, powerful chords. And then, for the first time, he heard Forsyth's voice in his mind, clear as day. "You are mine now, Liam, forever." The room grew cold, the shadows twisted, and Liam felt the cold, clammy fingers of Forsyth's spirit wrap around him. His heart raced, and he tried to stand up to break free. But it was too late. The music had already taken him, body and soul. Forsyth's spirit had fully claimed him. The next morning, the piano was silent. Liam's career was remembered for the beautiful, haunting melodies he had composed. But as the years went by, the piano was forgotten, its curse sealed once again. The world moved on, unaware of the dark force that had shaped Liam's genius, and the cursed piano waited, ready for the next musician who would be lured by its haunting music, its promises of fame, and the terrible price that came with it. For the spirit of Edgar Forsyth would never stop playing,